guys are listening to the Confronting Christianity podcast, and I'm here with my fellow countryman and I guess I'm a former now resident of Cambridge in the UK, and Mike Hood. Mike is an evangelist, pastor and writer who loves sharing the reality and beauty of Jesus, two things close to my heart as well. He is a former UCCF staff worker. So, Mike, you're going to explain to everybody what that means in a second. And church evangelist. You can also explain that. He's giving talks about the Christian faith to people of all ages, stages and backgrounds, including university outreaches all over the UK. He, like many of the best people, has a bachelor's degree in English literature from Cambridge University and an MA in Christian theology and ministry from Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary. And Crosslands training. Oh, it's fun, Mike, how many pieces of our background and our kind of communities overlap in different ways. He's also a spoken word poet. He's competed at the Royal Albert Hall, which for those outside of the UK is a big deal, and performed at the Big Church Festival. He works as one of the pastors at Eden Baptist Church in Cambridge in the UK. Mike, once upon a time, I was at Cambridge for 7 years. I went to the same college, studied the same subject, English literature, went to the same church and played for the same football team, the Americans would say soccer team, for a straight 7 years. And it was fabulous. And many of my friends, I went to another one of the kind of city centre churches in Cambridge, St Andrew the Great, or STAG for those who like acronyms. And many of my good friends went to Eden Baptist Church. So it's a delight to have a guy from Eden on the podcast.
It's a joy to be here.
So here's my first question for you. What did you love most about studying English literature?
Well, a lot of it was quite a surprise to me. I was expecting to go to university and learn what makes writing good writing. And it turned out that very, very few of the things I was reading or the lectures I was going to were interested in what makes writing good writing. But occasionally I did get bits of that. And I feel like it was a highlight for me when I had a week where I was writing a poem for a spoken words competition, and I was studying a poem by Coleridge, and something in the Coleridge poem made me think, oh, you should write something like that in the poem you're writing. And it changed that poem. And then, that was a fun moment for me. I was like, oh, this is why I wanted to do English literature, because I wanted to learn to write. Okay,
I see. Because you wanted to be a writer or a poet, and this was a sort of route to that. That's fascinating. Which college did you go to? I'm just now all about in Selwyn. Very nice.
Yeah, sort of not one of the famous ones, not one of the rich ones, but really close to the English department. So You could get up basically after the lecture had started and still get there in time.
Amazing. Just roll right in.
Yeah.
And were you, Mike, at that stage in your life, were you a follower of Jesus already, or not yet, or about to be? Or tell us the history of you at that stage.
Yeah, so I grew up with Christian parents who I'm really grateful for. For me, the pivotal moment of confronting the sort of skepticism that had been growing on me as a teenager.
Love use of confronting there, by the way.
Oh yeah, always. It's part of the contract, right, for this podcast that you have to drop it in at some point. So when I think it was 15, just about to be 16, that was when I realized, okay, I'm kind of going to church. I would say I'm a Christian, but I'm really not convinced, and I'm not kind of staking my life on it in any way because I'm not sure. And basically I then had a whole process of trying to think it through and work out what I actually believed and whether I trusted it. And so it was really thinking about the resurrection of Jesus then that persuaded me that must have really happened. There was evidence that Jesus really came back from the dead. And if that was true, I could actually trust him, and I really should follow him. And so I was then it was quite a gradual process of working out all of the implications of that and letting it kind of flow out. I suppose that process is still going, actually. I think that's kind of what being a Christian is like your whole life. But by the time I got to uni, I was, I'd made some progress on that journey of realizing what it means. Had some big wobbles while I was there, but I did trust that Jesus was real and he was alive.
I don't know what your undergrad English experience was, but part of mine was being pretty aware of the fact that most of my professors or lecturers and most of my peers were not only not followers of Jesus, but thought that it was pretty weird to be a Christian. Although it was sort of split, because my English professors, on the one hand, most of them absolutely wouldn't have taken Christianity seriously for themselves. And on the other hand, liked that I knew the Bible, because a lot of the literature that we were studying was sort of filled with biblical references that I, was picking up on in ways that I wouldn't have been if I hadn't known the Bible. So I'm kind of curious for your experience there as you were relating to fellow enthusiasts for words and beautiful writing, whether poetry or prose. Whether that presented challenges to your faith, being kind of more surrounded by people who were unimpressed with the claims of Christianity, or not considering them as a live option today, or how that impacted you.
Yeah, I think, well, like you say, it felt like it was a big head start. I'd been doing the pre-reading for that course for however many years of my life beforehand, because actually all of the best stories, particularly in the West, all of them have their roots in the Bible somehow. And, there were sort of seminars and stuff where we'd be talking about something and I'd say, well, it's a reference to the parable of the prodigal son, isn't it? And somebody else would turn around and say, hang on, what are we talking about here? And I'd end up telling the story of one of Jesus's parables in the seminar. I think on the whole, it kind of, I guess it did both. There were times where I felt quite challenged and it felt quite difficult to, I was in a seminar about Nietzsche and stuff, and I really thought I need to grapple with this properly, because if I just turn up having not done the reading and not thought this through, the conversation is going to be trampling all over Christianity, and I'm not going to know how to actually engage with that thoughtfully. And so the pressure was on to actually read it and think carefully and be able to see, what didn't make sense about what he was saying, what he was missing, all that sort of stuff. I think overall, in the end, it actually kind of worked the other way. I did a part of that same thing that had that seminar was a paper on moral philosophy in the West, but kind of engaging with it as literature, even stuff that wasn't written in English.
Was that English moralists?
Yeah,
is that what the paper was called? I remember I did the English, and I thought half the people were reading are neither English nor are they moral. Like, what?
Yeah, it was bizarre.
It was bizarre. The most mistitled course.
Yeah, but it was absolutely fascinating, because it's kind of, getting to engage with all of these different philosophers, and the more I did that, the more I kind of found myself seeing the strength and the beauty of Christianity by contrast. So, I think it kind of worked both ways. It made it socially a bit more intense and difficult, but actually intellectually, I think it probably strengthened my convictions about it.
That's interesting. Yeah, one of the actual English moralists, although I suppose in some ways he was sort of more of a scientist, but all of the above that I remember reading was Francis Bacon. And there's a delicious quote from Francis Bacon, which I think is in an essay titled On Atheism, where he says, "A little philosophy inclineth man's mind to atheism, but depth in philosophy bringeth man back to religion." And I've often thought of that as like the, not that that's everybody's experience, but that certainly it's, especially, reading somebody like Nietzsche. For me, it ends up being a massive validation of my faith in Jesus, because Nietzsche's sort of saying, everyone's going around as if you can pull Jesus out of the system and hold on to universal equality and care for the poor and the weak and the marginalized. And actually you can't. And why would we even want, Nietzsche's response is, why would we even want to? He thinks the cross is this massive inversion of the right values of kind of goodness and beauty, which he sees as sort of more in terms of the triumph of the strong than in the redemption of the weak. But he calls it correctly. He just comes then to opposite conclusions from you and me, but sort of fascinating along the way. So, Mike, it's interesting that you were it sounds like curious about, or not even curious about, but needing to really look carefully at the evidence for the central historical claim of the Christian faith, which was that Jesus not only died on a Roman cross, but also was raised from the dead a couple of days after that. That you felt the need to really dig into that quite early in your Christian life, so when you were a teenager, and that was something that, at least in your mind, could have gone one of two ways. You could have come out of that more convinced that Jesus did rise from the dead and that Christianity was worth sort of staking your life on, or you could have come out less convinced and thinking, actually, these Christians might be nice people, but they're a little bit naive. So talk us through a little bit of that process and how that's brought you to the point of writing the book that I'd love to talk with you more about today, titled "The If That Changes Everything: What If You Could Believe That Jesus Rose from the Dead?"
Yeah. So, I think I'm really grateful that in some ways that my kind of real journey with Christianity started there. And then in a sense, I've kept coming back to it and kept kind of wanting to dig a bit deeper. And, I had times at university where friends would kind of challenge my faith. And particularly there was one where I was really shaken. There were a whole bunch of things happening in my life at the same time. And I suddenly found myself not feeling like any of it was true. But it sent me back to asking the big kind of truth questions that I'd wrestled with before, but trying to, go over the ground again, go a bit deeper, look into it and think, okay, does the universe make any sense if there isn't a God behind it? And is there actually good reason for me to think that Jesus rose from the dead? And I think having I'm sat here having written a book about it, digging into it convinced me more and kind of made me think, actually, even if right now it doesn't feel like it, I have good reason to hold on to this, and it makes better sense of the facts than anything else I could go to. It was almost like, well, if I'm going to stop being a Christian, I've got to start being something, and just nothing else seemed to be in any way more plausible than what I was doubting and wrestling with in Christianity. So I think I'm really glad that it started there and that it's kind of been based there, because it's meant that like I was saying earlier, my kind of life following Jesus has all been kind of the overflow, the kind of outworking of, I actually think Jesus is real and he was really God in human form, and he really died for us, like because he loves us, and he actually came back from the dead, not as a metaphor, not as a sort of nice moral fable that tells you that everything turns out all right in the end, but actually physically, telling people, come touch my hands, they've still got the wounds from the nails that nailed me to the cross. And so it's not been a case of, it's meant that my whole journey with faith hasn't been going, well, this bit feels good, but this bit feels bad, or this works for me and this doesn't work for me. Obviously, I'm tempted to do that all the time and just ignore the bits that I don't like or that feel like they're hard. But having a kind of foundation in, no, I think Jesus is real and he's really alive and I need to listen to him, I think has kind of allowed that to grow in a much more rooted way, which has made it, I think, more secure against the times when it doesn't feel good, or it suddenly, you want to be doing something else or whatever it might be.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear you frame it that way, because in my experience, often people are thinking that they're choosing between Christianity with a bunch of crazy beliefs like Jesus rising from the dead and a completely kind of intellectually and morally satisfying alternative that doesn't include those crazy things. And that we're just not. I mean, again, like Nietzsche would say, you're absolute, like those are not your options. And so that we're taking a serious look at the claims of Christianity, not in a vacuum, but kind of like one of Jesus's first followers, Peter, who at one point in Jesus' ministry, a lot of people walked away. What Jesus was saying was just too much for them, and they walked away. And he turned to some of his closest followers and he says, how about you guys? Are you going to leave as well? And Peter famously says, Lord, where else should we go? You have the words of eternal life. And I think for me, kind of over the years, the times when I've thought, that I'm believing a lot of very weird and wonderful things as a follower of Jesus, and sometimes that's costly, and it would be easier to adapt Christian beliefs around my own ideas or preferences or whatever, and then to think, where else would I go? I mean, show me the alternative. In fact, that offers the radical, life-changing, beautiful story of Christianity, not untethered to claims of sort of historical truth or plausibly reconcilable with other things we know about the universe, but actually kind of underlying a lot of the ways that we end up thinking about the universe. I think when you actually compare Christianity with the other options, Jesus shines more and more brightly. But Mike, I'm curious, if somebody said to you, okay, you said you looked into the evidence of the resurrection, but are you seriously telling me that going back 2,000 years, that's a really long time, and we know that ancient historical records are exceedingly patchy. We have a handful of accounts of this claimed resurrection from some of Jesus's followers. So clearly they were invested in trying to tell a good story about Jesus. How can you be persuaded by those accounts today when we all know that people don't just rise from the dead? I mean, it's the central historical truth claim of Christianity, but it's also like one of the boldest to say we're claiming that this man who was brutally executed then walked out of his grave on the third day after that. Help us understand why you would find that convincing at all. Yeah.
Well, one of the reasons I'm convinced by the evidence that it happened is actually how weird it is. Because it was weird then. It's not just that it's weird now. And back then, if you say to somebody, "Oh, I heard that Jesus came back from the dead," everyone goes, "Oh, cool, right, yeah, sure."
Yeah.
And you even see in the accounts, you see in the biographies of Jesus, you can see the kind of shock and confusion and disbelief of the very friends and followers who'd been with him his whole life. Nobody was expecting a physical resurrection of Jesus, like of one guy in the middle of history. So, I mean, there's so many angles we could start to answer that question from, but one of them is we do have very good sort of textual evidence of the witness of the early apostles, the early kind of leaders of the Jesus movement, particularly Paul. We have loads of letters by Paul of Tarsus, and loads of those. No one, however skeptical they are as a scholar, doubts that those are written by Paul. And he is writing, 40 AD, 50 AD, some of them, they are really close to the time which is of these events, which is either 30 or 33 AD. So Paul basically is, so not only do we know kind of about that he wrote what he wrote about Jesus, but we also know his backstory. So he wasn't one of the followers of Jesus. He wasn't one of his friends. He was an opponent of Christianity, a member of the Pharisees, which is kind of strict Jewish sect. And he basically says in his letters that he saw Jesus back from the dead, and that was what changed his whole perspective on everything and made him, instead of a real serious opponent who was rounding up and arresting Christians, it made him instead into a Christian who was proclaiming that Jesus was alive. So even if you kind of forget everything else, just with Paul, you've got a massive historical mystery to solve. And there's no kind of long chain of transmission where a myth could have emerged over time. Like, we know what he wrote. We know that he wrote it really close to the time, way, way too quickly for the myth to have emerged. And he's writing letters to all of these Christian communities spread across kind of Greece and Turkey and Italy. And so it's not even, he's writing saying that he saw Jesus back from the dead, but not trying to persuade them as if it was a new thing that Jesus rose from the dead. He clearly thinks that everyone he's writing to in these early churches knows that that's the Christian story. That's what they've believed. That's what's made them a Christian. So it's not that it's that at that early stage, 20 years in, maybe, all over the empire, there are groups of people who all share this belief that Jesus rose from the dead, and his friends and Paul all saw it. And Paul writes to them just knowing that they think that. So there's no way it's a kind of gradual, vague, mythological thing. You've just got the kind of mystery of there are these core witnesses and we have their testimony, and they seem to be convinced that they met Jesus back from the dead. And then obviously you're into the question of why? Like, why would they have said that? And really, when you look into it, there are only a very few options that anyone has ever proposed for this. Either they're lying, but the problem with that is they have no motive to do it, because it's not a political power grab. It doesn't get them anything for themselves. All it does for them is get them in a huge amount of danger, because they're saying that the person that was crucified as a criminal by both the Jewish religious authorities and the Roman authorities, they're saying he's risen from the dead and he's actually the Lord of the universe, which unsurprisingly is not a popular message with those authorities. And we have all sorts of historical accounts, both within the Christian sort of witness and from outside, that say that they were subject to all sorts of persecution and imprisonment, and some of them died, maybe most of them, in the end, because they refused to go back on their claim that they'd seen Jesus back from the dead. So nobody serious thinks they were making it up. If you want to disbelieve the resurrection, probably your only serious option is to think that the disciples had hallucinations that convinced them that Jesus was alive. But the problem with that is, basically, that what we know about how hallucinations works shows you that can't explain the testimony that we've got. So the kind of big two appearances of the resurrected Jesus that we have loads and loads of testimony to are that he appeared to Paul, like I said, who used to be an opponent of Christianity, and that he appeared to the group of his disciples, the sort of 11 disciples that had followed him around for the previous 3 years, who'd been teaching and they'd been doing things with him. And
not to mention the women, right? Who
indeed, yes. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, and both to them individually and then to the wider group that included them. But what's particularly striking about the group ones and Paul is that there are just no psychological explanations for those. You do get grief hallucinations where maybe someone's lost a spouse that they've lived with for 30, 40, 50 years, and they sort of, after they've died, they think they saw them, or they think they heard their voice, or that's a thing that happens. We know that. But someone like Paul didn't know Jesus, wasn't sad he was dead. There's no psychological explanation for a hallucination like that. And the group appearances of Jesus, we know that can't be a hallucination, because hallucinations aren't group things. They happen inside your head like a dream, and you can't share a hallucination between multiple people. So that, it's kind of like you'd have to roll two dice with hundreds of sides on them and get a double six for Paul to somehow have this crazy psychological event. And then you'd have to do it again for all of the disciples and the women, and, get double six again for all of them at the same time, so that somehow they all have the same crazy psychological event. And even then, actually, a hallucination wouldn't explain what they said about the resurrection. There's a amazing 800-page massive tome on this by N.T. Wright. And the main thing he's basically proving in that is, with the background they had in both kind of Greek Roman thought and in the Old Testament and the Jewish scriptures, there is no way, if they had just had a hallucination or had a dream or had some kind of experience, that they would have made up or interpreted that in the way that they did. They would have either said that Jesus' spirit had returned in a sort of disembodied soul type of way, or they would have said that they would have kind of drawn on some of the promises in the Old Testament Jewish scriptures, and they'd have described Jesus coming back to life exactly like he was before, just a normal living human. But what they describe is this weird thing that's kind of got elements of both going on that don't work. So he's clearly physical. He's not a ghost. He eats to prove that he's really there. But he also can walk through locked doors, and he appears and disappears at will. And so basically N.T. Wright's conclusion after this huge scholarly thing is the accounts are too weird to be made up, and they're too weird to have been what you would say if you just had a weird hallucination as well.
Yeah. For those curious about that, I think you're talking about New Testament scholar N.T. Wright's book, The Resurrection of the Son of God, which is a long and fascinating read for those who want to kind of follow the footnotes. I think to build on that, for me, the fact that all four Gospels agree that it was the women who first saw the risen Jesus,
yes,
points to the authenticity of the accounts, because, for us, that doesn't seem strange. But if you were making up a story in the kind of first century cultural context that the Gospels were written into, the last thing you would have done would be to say that a bunch of over-emotional women claim that Jesus had risen from the dead. Because, women at that time were not seen as reliable witnesses in court in the same, like their testimony wasn't equivalent to that of a man. And in particular, when it came to religious questions, and historian and Bible scholar Richard Baucom's really interesting on this. He says that women were seen as religiously kind of gullible and over-emotional and susceptible to believing stuff. And so if you were trying to come up with a convincing account for a wild claim like Jesus rose from the dead, you would not have said, oh, a bunch of women saw it. And in fact, there's this sort of embarrassing and almost comic moment in Luke's gospel when the women come to the male disciples and they say, we've seen Jesus. Actually, no, sorry, in Luke's gospel, they say, we've seen the empty tomb, we've had an encounter with an angel. And it seems like Jesus has risen from the dead, and the male disciples think that this is an idle tale, and they won't believe it. It's one of many super embarrassing moments for the apostles Jesus appointed, that they just don't get the memo. But it's fascinating how women across all four Gospels are the first witnesses, and how Mary Magdalene is central to that. And in John's Gospel in particular, John makes this great play of the fact that Mary's weeping. So she's playing the stereotypical kind of over-emotional woman, and it's precisely in that context that she meets Jesus. And yeah, if you were coming up with this account from scratch, or trying to make it sound plausible to first century readers, it's the last thing you would have done. You're shooting yourself in the foot there. So
absolutely,
it's like the only reason this would have been written down this way is if it actually happened that way.
Yes.
And I find it fascinating as well in John's Gospel that it's evident Jesus could have revealed himself to Peter and John first, because they're actually around. But instead he chooses to reveal himself to the women Just saying.
Yeah.
Just saying.
Absolutely. I love it. Yeah, like so many things in the Gospels, it simultaneously gives you really good reason to think that they weren't making it up. And it gives you this wonderful window into what Jesus was like. And absolutely.
Mike, as you were writing your book, was there anything, my guess is that as you went into the process of writing it, you thought, okay, here are some things that I want to say. Were there things you discovered along the way that surprised you, or were kind of fresh pieces of evidence or insight from your perspective?
That's a good question. And it was, it's been a long process, so it's hard to remember what I only learnt while I was doing it. I think, I mean, lots of, I was really grateful to get to do lots of research for the chapter where I kind of dig into the evidence. And there was lots of that sort of stuff where I knew I'd been convinced by the sort of simple form of the argument. And then as I was reading into it, you kind of discover, there's layers on layers here. Like it's not just that there wasn't time for a myth to emerge. It's that if a myth if they had made up a myth, it wouldn't have looked like this one, or, it's, or realizing that, so one thing that I hadn't thought of until I was writing the book was basically that there's a question about motivation that helps basically with any time you think, well, maybe some early Christian made this up or added this, whether it's the disciples making it up or whether it's early Christian communities exaggerating the stories. It hadn't occurred to me until I was looking into it for the book that to think that anything like that has happened, you have to assume that people who genuinely believe this, genuinely are devout believers in Jesus and in him being the revelation of the God who was revealed in the Old Testament as well. They have to be willing to change the story that they've heard. And when you think about it, the Old Testament is really big on truthfulness, really negative about lying. It's one of the 10 Commandments. Jesus, really big on truthfulness, really negative about lying. And whoever has become a Christian in the early days, for whatever reason, they have been convinced by the message as they've heard it. And so you've got to imagine somebody who's a devoutly religious person thinking that they want to improve the story that they heard, even though it was good enough for them, and that they're willing to bend the truth to do that. So for me, I found that really helpful to just kind of realize a lot of the time when people talk about alternative explanations for the testimonies that we have, they're actually just not really thinking about the psychology. Like they're not thinking about them as real human beings who would have had to do these things.
Yeah. And even, I think it was Richard Dawkins in one of his books a few years ago who described it like, you can imagine there was this very charismatic Jewish rabbi, Jesus of Nazareth, and then he died and stories started to grow up like, he did these miracles and then suddenly we've got a virgin birth and then suddenly we've got this claim that he rose from the dead, and it's kind of all getting a little bit out of hand as these eager recruits to Christianity sort of start to add some icing on the cake. But the problem is without the resurrection, there isn't a cake. There's just, what's the message? Without the resurrection, it's this guy claimed to be the Messiah, the king that God had been promising to send to the Jews for centuries. He was executed, which proved that he wasn't. Yeah. That's all you've got. Really, there's... So there is no early Christian movement without the resurrection claim. And, you can believe it or disbelieve it, but it doesn't actually make any sense to say, at some point, some extra keen early recruits to Christianity added the resurrection bit. Because it's like saying, I have this car and then, at some point I'm going to add an engine. Well, okay, it's not going to go without the engine. So we can, you could be adding the headlights is fine, but you really can't be just adding the resurrection at a later date. Yes. It doesn't make any sense. And the Romans knew what to do with Messiah claimants. You crucified them. That was the way to stamp out the movement. And if it was going to continue, it would be like somebody else would pick up the mantle and maybe it was the cousin of the guy, or maybe it was, some other figure that people could coalesce around and say, well, yeah, that wasn't really the Messiah, but this is. But with Jesus, there's no attempt to do that. They instead make this weird claim that the guy who you saw crucified, utterly defeated by Rome, is actually the king of all the universe. Like that's the claim that Christianity's making. It's completely wild.
Yeah, and it kind of, if it's not for the resurrection, it comes out of nowhere, and then for the next 300 years, it takes so long for you to get to a situation where there's anything in it for you to make this up. So it makes no sense to think that it sort of emerges from anywhere other than the resurrection, and then there's no ulterior motive for it for years and years and years and years. So it just, the only way that the history makes any logical sense is that there's this massive, crazy, life-changing event that they thought was Jesus coming back from the dead. I don't see any better explanation for it.
Well, that's a wonderful place for us to end, Mike. If you guys want to grab a copy of Mike's book, the title again is The If That Changes Everything. What if you could believe that Jesus rose from the dead? You might also be interested in an episode I recorded with historian Molly Worthen a couple of seasons ago, who is a history professor at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, who became a Christian a couple of years ago, partly from actually reading that N.T. Wright book and looking at footnotes and following the evidence and coming to the conclusion that from her professional perspective as a historian, that the evidence for the resurrection was actually very strong. So between now and next week, when I'm maybe speaking into your earpods again, I'd love for everybody listening to reflect on the reality that we all agree on, actually, whether you would call yourself a Christian or not. My guess is that all of us are aware, at least in some pocket of our mind, that we will one day die, that might come for us sooner or it might come for us later, but it's going to come for us one way or another. And I'd love you to ask yourself, do I have any reason for hope in the face of that event? Do I have any rational reason to think that there is a life for me beyond death, or that everything that I hold to be dear now, in fact, will be cancelled by that unmissable appointment with death that each of us has? And if you don't feel like you have that hope, I would encourage you, as I'm sure Mike would as well, to look at the evidence for Jesus' resurrection and to consider whether actually, as well as being, by many accounts, the greatest story ever told, that the story of Jesus might also be true.